What's up guys? So today I'm going to be doing a video on why lectures don't work. Initially I was kind of hesitant to make this video because a lot of people already hold the opinion that lectures aren't a great educational device. But actually I thought that this question gives me a good opportunity to talk about one of the most confusing concepts from the Pleasure of Learning article that I discussed earlier, the concept of Learntropy. By understanding the concept of Learntropy, I think it gives you a really good sense for why lectures and universal delivery of education in general simply can't work. So Learntropy is a concept developed by Piotr Wozniak, and I actually discussed Learntropy briefly before in my video summary of The Pleasure of Learning. If you haven't checked out that video already, I'll leave a link in the description. I strongly recommend it. So after I uploaded my video summary of the Pleasure of Learning article, a couple of people messaged me and they were kind of confused because they started reading the Pleasure of Learning article and they scrolled down and they immediately get hit by this section on learn drive and entropy. And basically Wozniak makes a bunch of comparisons between this concept in information theory called Shannon Entropy and how you can understand it in the context of human learning. I think a lot of people start the Pleasure of Learning article and they get put off by the part on Shannon Entropy and information theory because it's just too confusing. And they sort of quit the article before they get to the much more intuitive tree metaphor, which comes pretty much right at the end of the article. So I think that's a shame. And so today I'm going to try and break down the concept of Learntropy and explain it in a context that you're probably familiar with, the context of lectures. So to begin with, I think we can return again to one of the concepts that I described in the Pleasure of Learning video summary, and that is the concept of knowledge valuation. Knowledge valuation essentially concerns the question of what information are we attracted to. In that video, I described how when a new piece of information comes into the brain, it undergoes neural processing, during which the brain asks a series of questions to determine how that piece of information should be valued. The first question that the brain would ask is this new piece of information surprising? Surprising information tends to be highly valued by the brain. The second question would be, is this new piece of information consistent with my prior knowledge, my theories about the world, and my models of reality? And finally, the brain would ask, is this new piece of information coherent? Is it meaningful to me or not? So information that answers positively to all of those questions will be very highly valued by the brain. And information that is highly valued by the brain tends to be very easy to slot in to our prior knowledge. So based on all of this, one of the questions you might be interested in is, can we measure how interesting a piece of information is? In the 1940s, a researcher called Claude Shannon actually came up with a mathematical theory of how we might measure the information content of a message. In 1948, he published a paper titled A Mathematical Theory of Communication, in which he quantified the amount of information contained within a message based on the surprisal of that information. Shannon Entropy quantifies the surprisal of a message based on its probability. That is to say that if you read a message that has a very low probability and therefore is very surprising to you, you gain a lot of information. By the way, if the name Shannon Entropy is confusing you at all, there's actually a really interesting backstory behind it. Claude Shannon originally wasn't sure what to call his new concept, so he called up his buddy John von Neumann, a very famous mathematician, and asked him for help. Von Neumann said the following: you should call it entropy for two reasons. In the first place, your uncertainty function has been used in statistical mechanics under that name, so it already has a name. And in the second place, and more important, nobody knows what entropy really is, so in a debate, you will always have the advantage. So if the references to Shannon Entropy are confusing you, you don't need to feel bad, because the name was originally chosen kind of to bamboozle you. So let's look at a concrete example of Shannon Entropy. English text, treated as a series of characters, has quite a low Shannon Entropy. That's because it's kind of predictable and not very surprising. We can be fairly certain, based on a frequency analysis of characters over a large corpus of English language text, that the letter S is going to be more likely to show up than the letter Z. Therefore, when we're shown that the last letter of the word was S, the result isn't that surprising to us. We were able to predict it, and therefore the message doesn't contain as much information. If it had been revealed to us that the last letter of the word was Z, the result would be more surprising, less predictable, and therefore it would contain more information. A really important point to bear in mind about Shannon Entropy is that it's an objective measure. That means that the measurement of Shannon Entropy is completely independent of the observer. So whether you're an English native speaker, a French native speaker, or a cat, the Shannon Entropy contained within a message is going to be the same for each of them. So there's a critical difference between the way that Shannon defined information and how we understand meaning and knowledge. Information, as Shannon defines it, is objective. It doesn't depend on, for example, the observer's prior knowledge, their theories about the world, or their models of reality. This differs very strongly with the concept of meaning, which requires interpretation, and interpretation can be thought of as a kind of knowledge comparison between the new information coming in and your prior knowledge. The measure of meaning must involve the brain of the observer because the interpretation process carried out on raw information to create meaning depends on prior knowledge. So that's the reason why Wozniak comes up with this new concept of Learntropy. Learntropy differs from Shannon Entropy in that it contains this knowledge comparison step where the new information coming into the brain is compared with the prior knowledge to determine how it should be valued by the brain. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, one of the questions that the brain asks during neural processing is this new information surprising? But the surprisal in Learntropy is fundamentally different from the notion of surprisal in information theory. In fact, all three of the measures that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, which the brain uses to determine the value of a piece of information, surprisal, consistency, and coherency, are all based on a comparison with the prior knowledge of the observer. So at this point, I think we're finally ready to get into what was supposed to be the main topic for this video, why lectures don't work. So here you can see a representation of 3 students watching a lecture. You can see that in each case, the information from the lecture is flowing into each student's mind. But for each student, the reaction of the brain to that information that's flowing in is very different. Take, for example, the student in the top left. You can see that their prior knowledge, represented by the yellow network of nodes, is not sufficient to make the new information flowing into the mind relatable in any meaningful way. In this circumstance, we can say that the semantic distance for that student to learn this new information is too far. Lacking the prerequisite knowledge to understand a lecture is like listening to a channel of pure static noise, or watching a TV program in a foreign language you don't understand. The semantic distance between what you already know and the new information is too far. You simply can't relate it to anything already stored in your mind. Attempts to decode the incoming information by making it relatable to what you already know are destined to fail, and this student is likely to experience frustration and boredom at not being able to understand. Of course, the problem is compounded by the fact that the student can't simply hit pause and give themselves time to build up their prior knowledge, which is required to understand the lecture. Instead, they have to just sit there and endure the displeasure and frustration of not understanding what's being taught to them. So based on these factors, we can say that the Learntropy, or the attractiveness of the lecture to that student, is very low. Now let's take a look at the student in the bottom left. For this student, the information flowing from the lecture into their mind is consistent and coherent with their prior knowledge. The new information seems to just slot in effortlessly into what they already know. The new information, combined with their prior knowledge, could generate a new creative association that could cause them to punch the air and scream Eureka. So for this student, the new information flowing into the mind is perfectly suited to their prior knowledge. Rather than this lecture being a boring grind like it was for the first student, this is going to be a golden nugget-filled adventure full of new interesting surprises. Because the lecture is very interesting and has the potential to generate new creative insights for this student, we can say that the Learntropy is very high. Finally, let's take a look at the last student in the top right. In this case, you can see that in their prior knowledge, they've already crystallized this golden nugget filled with all of the interesting insights that are coming from the lecture. Perhaps they've watched the lecture before, or they've learnt this information from other sources. In this case, the new information flowing into their mind may be consistent and coherent, but it doesn't have the surprisal factor. There's nothing in the new information that generates new associations or makes them see the world in a different light. So while they can perfectly understand what's being taught to them, they might be extremely bored and frustrated and feel like they're wasting their time. For this student, the lecture has a low attractiveness and therefore a low Learntropy. Notice how for each student, while the Shannon Entropy, the objective measure of information developed by Claude Shannon, would be the same, the Learntropy for each student would be very different and would depend strongly on their prior knowledge. So given the fine-grained nature of the comparison between new information and prior knowledge that underlies how attracted we are to new information, any attempt to deliver one source of information to a group of different students, each with a different level of prior knowledge, is going to be futile. Even students who would appear to have roughly the same prior knowledge based on their prior attendance at some courses leading up to this lecture could in actuality have very different prior knowledge actually stored in their mind. This could be due to the fact that some students are learning outside of those courses and assimilating different knowledge into their prior knowledge than some of the other students in the class. But discrepancies in prior knowledge could also be caused by the natural decay of memories over time, which would occur at different rates for each student based on how well that material was assimilated into their prior knowledge initially and how stable those memories remained over time. The best option, therefore, for a lecture designed for a college class, for example, of 300 students, is to design the information of the lecture to be compatible with the average prior knowledge of all of those students. But in doing so, you manufacture a stale, homogeneous blob of information rather than something that can really appeal to people's niche interests and what they really care about. And for that reason, compulsory lectures and universal delivery of education as a whole are doomed to be mediocre and uninteresting. Okay guys, so that's it for this video today. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please do let me know in the comments if this is the kind of video you want me to make, or if you have any other suggestions. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.